Hi, my name is Gareth Wiltshire, and as you can see, the title of this talk is Psychological and Sociological Hopes and Fears about Sport and Exercise After Transplantation. Brief introduction and background into myself and the research that I'm talking about today. I'm a senior lecturer at Loughborough University in the UK in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. Now, because we are a diverse school, it's worth saying that I'm primarily a sociologist, but I work in an interdisciplinary way. I draw on ideas from philosophy, psychology, medical sociology, and phenomenology. I like to work with people across different disciplines and different traditions as well. In terms of my research in sport and exercise for transplant recipients, it's an emerging, growing area of mine. With a keen interest. So I published 2 papers so far from one study, working with some excellent co-authors. So we can see this first paper here is published in the Qualitative Health Research, called Organ Transplant Recipients' Experience of Physical Activity, Health, Self-Care and Transliminality, and you can see the co-authors there. And the second paper from the same study was published in the International Review for the Sociology of Sport, and that was about the role of sport in social networks. And that was some insights gained from the World Transplant Games. My other experience in terms of engaging with research in this area is having the pleasure of supervising one PhD, Dr. Carl Vescovi, and that was at the University of Bath. Now, Carl is talking a little bit later on in the session, so I won't say much more about his research, although there will be some overlaps between what I'm talking about today and some of the findings from Carl's study. So what do I mean by psychological and sociological hopes and fears, just to kind of set us up on this talk? What do I mean by these things? So I think a very basic conception, a very basic understanding of these ideas is that I'm thinking of sociological and psychological phenomena as being overlapping, intertwined or inextricably linked. So taking an example of a scar, for example, which is kind of a physical, the appearance of the skin on the body from a physical phenomenon. We experience this sociologically and psychologically. So the things around a scar, thinking socially, might actually be around how scars are presented in popular culture, in the media, what others might say to us and think about us when being presented with a scar. And psychologically, on the psychological end of the continuum, we might think about the kind of internalized feelings, the private thoughts and emotions that come with having a scar. But clearly all these things are intertwined and interlinked. So I'm taking this view all the way through the rest of the talk. So I'm going to say hopes and fears in talking about this presentation. With hopes, I'm talking about the possible benefits. Okay, what are we optimistic about? What is there to be positive about when thinking about engaging with sport exercise after transplantation? And with fears, I'm thinking more about the concerns and possible harms. What do we need to be critical of? What do we need to be cautious of sociologically and psychologically when we're thinking about engaging with exercise and sport after transplantation? And why are we talking about this? Just a brief kind of justification, just in case we needed it. I suppose that most people will be sold on this idea in this talk anyway, but just to kind of hit home, I really like to come back to this quote from Iwashina in 2010. The idea that long-term health and well-being is a defining medical challenge of the 21st century. This is because we can save many patients' lives, but we need to broaden our sense of our mission to include understanding, caring for, and improving the lives of those many patients who survive critical illness. Okay, so going beyond survival, and now that we know that we can actually get people living longer, we need to make sure that that life is actually worth living. So also Shildra Cattell talk about the emotional experiences of recipients to rebuild personally worthwhile lives after surviving critical illness is seldom paid enough attention. And Bitterman talks about how healthcare practitioners must not only provide high quality evidence-based medical care, but also empower recipients with the self-care tools for long-term post-transplant success. So this is the sort of realm that I'm engaging with today and the realm that I'm interested in. So hopes and fears then. So what do we have what do we need to be hopeful about? What do we need? What can we be optimistic about? Why would we want to send people and suggest to people who've had organ transplant, suggest that doing sport, physical activity, and exercise is a good thing? So I think one thing that comes to mind really quickly is something like, improvements in short-term psychological functioning. So if it might make you feel better, it might improve your mood, it might improve someone's confidence, these kinds of issues. So I think this is fairly intuitive, and that's the experience of a lot of people. There is, of course, some evidence to support this, looking at a study undertaken by Ray and London Wood. This is children going to a transplant games event and taking some measurements on a short questionnaire about psychological measures. Found that the majority of people in their study going to the transplant games was associated with a positive impact on psychological functioning in the short term. So that's one thing. A second thing might be a sense of normality. I think this is something we might hope for when we are recommending people to do exercise and sport after having a transplant. So we know that this is important. Looking at the literature more widely back in 2002, Wise did a phenomenological study with pediatric patients, saying that the children strived for normalcy in their ordinary everyday lives. So they have these extraordinary illness experiences, but a lot of what they wanted to do, what they wanted to focus on, they wanted to ignore the extraordinary things and try and focus on the things that made them feel normal. So that can be normal in relation to their own, in relation to what they consider the general population to be doing, to be able to do, but also what you yourself consider normal if you have a previous pre-transplant experience to give you a point of reference. So in one of the studies that I mentioned at the start of the talk, we had this kind of quote coming back from a participant who took part in the transplant games. So going to the games and being competitive represented a return to his younger, healthier, more competitive self. So in a way, that's kind of going back to normal. So me being able to establish myself with some competitiveness again that I had when I was like 16, stuff like that has been a really positive thing. Third, there might be a sense of achievement that we get from sport as well. I'm talking about sport and physical activity here. So I think the thing about these kind of things is that they do involve the possibility of failure. So it involves necessarily something that you might feel proud of for actually being successful in. So while sport is important, simply doing some exercise is important too. For this participant, it was about walking to the pier and back with a dog, and that felt like a real milestone, and it felt like a real achievement for this liver transplant patient after having undergone the transplant. Being able to do that again like she used to be able to do was a real achievement. So this is something to be hopeful about. This is why you might encourage someone to do physical activity. They might feel improvements in psychological functioning, a sense of normality, a sense of achievement. Other things are important as well, though. So improving your social network might be something. And I think this is probably more uniquely about sport. So rather than taking the dog for a walk to the pier and back, sports usually involve some kind of social interaction, and there may be some bonding involved in engaging in sport. So just to briefly take from some data from Carl's study. This is what you're looking at now is a social network map of all the different shapes. There are different people in one person's social network, people that help them to self-manage their illness. Now, after going to a transplant games event, this was done, and you can see that all of these people in the study were actually people who were that this participant met at the transplant games event. So we're confident this might have some implications. You might go to a games and then come back and actually have some people that you now consider to be in your support network. And we also might think of sport and things like the transplant games as playing a small part in public attitudes to organ donation too. So now this is something that has been talked about for a long time, but I think there's probably some need for some more evidence on this kind of thing. Okay, so what about the fears though? I do think there are some things to be concerned about, and I think these are probably things that we might need to reflect on more as a community that promotes exercise and physical activity to organ transplant recipients. What might we be concerned about? I think there's a real concern about the idea of responsibilization. Now, this is something which is widely talked about in physical activity promotion literature more broadly for public health. The idea that lifestyle behaviors do have a tendency, when we start recommending what people should do, how much they should do, there's a tendency to draw on the ideas of willpower, individual motivation. If you want to be healthy, all you need to do is put your shoes on and exercise a little bit more. Now, there's a concern here. This is great if you manage to do it, you feel good, you know, it's your responsibility and you managed to do it successfully, so well done, you can give yourself a pat on the back. But it is very damaging and harmful if you don't manage to do that. So you get the sense that it's your fault and your own responsibility. Is quite a damaging idea. We might be concerned about success story bias. We hear lots of positive stories of people who've managed to overcome obstacles and barriers when we're talking about organ transplant recipients. So this might have some problems, whether we're thinking as a community or even at the level of individual patients themselves as well. So in the same way that a rich entrepreneur who sort of works hard may think that they've become rich and successful because they've been working hard, and kind of ignore and forget all the other people who worked hard but simply weren't quite as lucky, fortunate, or as privileged as them. They didn't have any other constraints that led to their success. So I think this is something which is important to think about, and maybe need to consider making sure we share stories of failure and people who have tried hard and used their willpower to exercise but actually haven't managed to do it through no fault of their own. Inequalities is something I think we need to be concerned about more and talk about a little bit more as well. So just taking one type of inequality between socioeconomic groups. We know in the broader population, at a population level, looking at Sport England survey data here, we know that the higher socioeconomic groups are more active and less sedentary than people in lower socioeconomic groups. I've got no reason to believe why this wouldn't map across into transplant population as well. So something that's important to bear in mind. So while I've talked about hopes and fears, there are a couple of points that I'll finish on that I think are kind of in between and the kind of it depends, but really interesting points to think about going forward. So the first one is the idea of guilt and obligation. Now these are ideas that come up a lot in the literature. So there's a moral burden to kind of live well after a transplant, and people have feelings of obligation, and the language of gift or donation can impact on people's emotional relationship with their donor. So actually engaging exercise is a way of dealing with this guilt and obligation, a way of demonstrating gratitude. You know, someone had to die for me to give me a liver, and that's really important, and you owe it to them a bit. So I guess the question here is, does exercise promotion alleviate this sense of guilt, or does it actually magnify it? Does it remind you of this obligation? This has been talked about in the literature before, so people have noticed it. People need to participate in order to avoid feelings of guilt and shame. So they actually discussed in this paper psychologically whether we can use that as a motivational tool to get people to exercise. But they raised serious concern that it's not likely to lead to sustainable engagement over time. I think we might ask ethical questions of doing that as well. So we certainly need to be cautious of that. And finally, the idea of identity, I think, is important. I know Carl's interested in this topic as well. So who am I now? So identity is a serious question which is raised in the transplant literature. It often receives the recipient with questions about who they are. Resistance and acceptance are part of the process, and people need to learn to integrate illness into their identity. Cormier talks about the idea of a new transplanted self, and language like liminality and transliminality draw on the idea of being in between healthy and ill. Now, engaging with exercise, I think, is an identity building process. So the quotes like this came up in our study, and we talked about being, after having a transplant, it's about a new me and seeing what I can do. And people want to establish themselves with competitiveness and show off their new lungs. So I guess the question here is, are we hopeful about this? Will sport exercise bring recipients closer to what they see as their identity? So it might have some positive benefits. Or might it also reveal a frustrating separation between body and self and actually lead to some identity disruptions and identity challenges? So thank you very much for this talk, and I look forward to hearing other people's talks and some questions as well. Feel free to get in touch with any follow-up discussions. Thank you very much.